All right, so as we've advertised, we're gonna be learning about React. Again, this is one of my favorite technologies to work with, so hopefully some of you guys also enjoy it. React is primarily used for front-end development, so we're gonna be focusing on that for this week and next week. So again, I'm not a psychologist or anything like that, but I know there's some psychology in learning new material, and usually the first thing in a presentation and the last thing in a presentation usually sticks with with the audience member the most. So with that in mind, I'm going to start with a public service announcement. And I hope it's not going to make sense right now to most of us, but hopefully by the end of this lecture, it's burned into your brain. So with that, my PSA for everybody is this. So maybe a little hard to read, but a public service announcement is do not manually edit state and prop values directly. Now, again, I know this makes very little sense, if at all, any sense to you guys right now, but I want this kind of fact to be burned in your brain. So let's stare at this for maybe, 3 minutes or something like that. Not that long, but keep this in mind. Again, we're going to come back to it, but this is like a rule of thumb for React. It's easy to forget because React has its own ways of operating. It's easy to kind of get around that. There's no errors you're running to if you do manually edit state and prop values. But we're going to see today why we should not be doing this. All right, so that's my PSA to start this lecture. It'll make more sense as we go forward. Let's first talk about React. What is React? So React is a JavaScript library used for creating front-end development or front-end user interfaces. I'm not a huge fan of Facebook personally, but I think this is a really cool technology. So props to Facebook for creating it. It is open source, and the main I guess, tag item that we're going to learn about is components. Components are the building blocks of React applications. We're going to learn how to create them, how to operate with them, and kind of what they do for us in a React application. I should mention, we have a lot of examples on our curriculum page, so hopefully you're following along. Today would be one of those rare opportunities where I would say we should code along together. So I know normally we recommend not coding along with our lectures, but since we're learning something new today and we're going to go really slow today, I'm definitely going to encourage you guys to code along with us. So if you're up for that, please try to stay with us. Again, you can find the notes on our curriculum page. So if you do get behind, hopefully you'll be able to catch up by following that. So to start, we're not even going to talk about React. We're going to talk about JavaScript and HTML. This is something that we did a few weeks ago where we just created some HTML pages and added some logic using JavaScript. We're going to do the same thing and see what it takes to create a very simple page just using JavaScript, no React here. So for that, I'm going to go to my coding window, which is somewhere here. All right, so I'm going to create a new page and call it index.html. And then I'm also going to create a new JavaScript file, call it index.js. All right, so my index.js is going to be the logic for my index.html. So I'm going to quickly create my HTML page. I don't want to create typos, and I usually do that. So I'm just going to copy straight from the curriculum page so that we don't have any inconsistencies. So just dropping this in for index.html. Nothing too exciting going on here. We have our HTML tag, head tags, body tags. We are linking our JavaScript with a script tag. Hopefully we've seen this before, so none of this should be new. But again, pretty boring HTML page here. My goal with JavaScript is to insert some content into this section right here. So if I launch this page right now, you guys won't be amazed because there'll be nothing to see. Let's see if my window comes up. Yep, this is my page right now. There's no content on it. What I'm going to do is go to my JavaScript. And again, I don't want to type this all out because one, it's a lot to type, and two, I don't want to make typos. So I'm going to copy again from the curriculum page, and let's go through the code and make sure we understand what the JavaScript is doing. So let me try to copy all that. All right, so we're going to add a few elements dynamically using JavaScript. So this is everything I copied from the curriculum page. Let's make sure we understand it. So we have a global variable called counter. We're going to be using that in our logic. Our window onload method, this method gets called when your HTML page fully loads. So once that loads, this logic is going to be executed automatically by your browser. Let's see what's going on here. So it looks like we're creating a few elements. So if you guys remember, document.create element lets you create brand new HTML nodes or elements for your page. So we create a header element and just say, this is my button click counter app. We also create a new button element. So that's what this portion of the code is doing. Again, we pass in the type of element we want to create. We add in attributes. So like ID is usually a good one to add. We have account attribute. This is a custom attribute we can add. Event listener. So this is the event that we're going to kind of spy on. And then also add the text for the button. We also create a paragraph element. This is going to be our output. So we name it my output. We're going to populate it with some text. So I created a function just because I'm going to reuse that function somewhere else. It's going to basically show how many times I've actually clicked that button that we're creating. Okay. And then finally, after we create all of these elements, we actually need to add it to our DOM. So right now they're just floating out in space. We need to attach to something that exists inside our HTML document. So if you remember, I had a node called body. So ID body for my body element. I'm going to attach children elements right here by finding the body element and appending children to this element. So that's what this section of code is doing right here. We are finding the body elements and then adding on each new node that we just created. Any questions about this code? Andrew.
Just a very quick one. Since increment counter is called before it gets defined down there, is that an error?
Good question. So this is a slight difference between JavaScript and Python. JavaScript has something called hoisting. I don't know if we've officially talked about it, but JavaScript lets you actually call a method, which Andrew detected. Right here, we're not even calling the method, but we are referencing a method here that only gets declared later on. In JavaScript, this is okay. Hoisting allows you to define something later on and it gets hoisted above. I don't know, hoisting, we don't really use that word in English very often, but we're just it gets pulled to the very top. So we can use it right here, even though it's defined later on. In Python, this would not be allowed. So that's a key distinction between JavaScript and Python, but good question. Yeah. So here we can create it later on. It's going to work fine. So that is our event listener for click is going to call our increment counter function. So probably a good time to talk about that. So whenever we do click this button that we create, it's going to go into this function and do a couple things for us. It's going to increment that global variable that we had, and then it's going to update the output label. So we're going to find that element and then update its text by whatever the new value of counter is. All right, so nothing too crazy going on here. Again, I just want to show how we can achieve something very simple in JavaScript and HTML. Again, not using React right now. However, I will kind of say this is a lot of code for very little output. So we actually look at what our page looks like now. If everything's linked up correctly, we should have something that looks like this. Let me make this a little larger. We have our header element, our button elements, and our paragraph element. And now if I click this button, notice that the counter actually goes up. So it's actually keeping track of how many times I actually click that button. All right, so kind of cool. Nothing too amazing, I know, but we can keep clicking it, counter keeps going up. So again, 3 elements that we created, and we had to write that much code to accomplish that. Again, not the most code we've ever seen, but it's definitely a bit tedious to just do something that simple. Imagine if my HTML page needed like 20 different elements with many different attributes and like other event listeners and all that jazz. This code is going to get quite bloated really quickly for that example. So we can definitely achieve things with JavaScript and HTML, but again, it's a lot more work than it needs to be, especially when React exists. So React is meant to make development much easier. For doing something as simple as this, we can create something much quicker using React than I would say writing all this up by hand. All right, so with that said, let's actually create our first React app. So again, hopefully you are encouraged to code along, no pressure to do so, but let's create our first React app. So to do that, I'm going to go to my terminal. I'm gonna get rid of these files or get them off my screen. All right, so in your terminal, whatever project folder you're in, you wanna run a command. So this command is going to be npx create dash react dash app. It must be named this. This is basically a package that we're running from the web. So npx stands for node package executable. I know we've seen npm, which is node package manager, I believe. That is for downloading libraries to your computer. This will actually run whatever's in this library and install all that stuff for us. So we're going to be running create React app. This is a pre-built package that has everything we need to get a React application started. So I run npx create React app, and I need to name my app. In this case, I'm going to name my app button counter app. You guys can name your app whatever you want. This is going to create a new folder called button counter app, and it's going to put all the React requirements in there. All right, so with this in place, I'm going to hit enter. This thing actually takes a while. It's downloading a lot of files to your computer. I want to say it's around like a gigabyte per React app that you were creating. So my computer does not have a lot of space. Make sure you delete these extra React folders if you're not using the project. Jake, you have a question?
Yeah, could you show me your index.html real quick?
Sure. Yeah, again, I just copied this from the curriculum page. Main thing is I have a body with an ID so that I can target that element in my JavaScript code to insert new items here.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
So yeah, we definitely have some time here. So again, on my computer, based on my internet speed, it takes around a minute, maybe a minute 30 to download everything. So it is a sizable download. So you definitely have some time to contemplate life or just reflect on whatever you need to reflect on. Again, this is still downloading, so got some time on our hands. But yeah, so again, every time you want to create a React app from scratch, you want to run npx create React app and the name of the app you want to run. There are some limitations on what you can use for naming. I believe you cannot use underscores. You cannot use spaces for your name. So there are some naming restrictions that you might run into. We got some hands raised, so got some time. Let's go with Andrew Tran. Question?
Since every time we do it, it downloads a gig and we didn't like specify anything other than the file name, couldn't we just copy, paste the file over and rename it?
We could. So each project you're going to be modifying. The core files will be the same. So you could do a copy and paste. But I guess the drawback of that is what if React gets updated? What if something gets changed with Create React app? You always want a fresh copy, I would say, unless you specifically want to use the same versions each time. So yeah, I guess if you want to copy and paste, I don't think there's too much harm with that. But I'd say using Create React app shouldn't take too long. Again, it took me probably like 90 seconds. Not super long, not super quick either. But yeah, you could copy the core React file. So we actually look into our React folder now. Again, keep in mind index.html, index.js, those are our files. So please don't get confused with those. I'm maybe gonna put them somewhere else. But the files that got added were everything in here. So I'm just gonna actually delete my index.js just so we're not confused that those did not get added. We'll say bye-bye to those. Everything in here is what got downloaded. The main bulk of the files are the Node modules. So if you guys remember when we're using Node, these are all the libraries that got downloaded. If you kind of scroll through them, there's a bunch of them, maybe 100. I don't know, I've never counted, but these are all the files that were downloaded. Going back to Andrew's question or suggestion, you could copy this Node modules folder, place it somewhere on your computer and just copy it each time, but it's not, I don't think that's gonna be as user-friendly. So that's my 2 cents there. Sanjaya, do you have a question?
So earlier in the index.js file, we had the Windows onload function, right? So it just basically says to load the JavaScript files when the Windows load, right? So without that, without the Windows onload function, if we just put the JavaScript queries, not the queries, but sorry, the code, would that still run?
So the onload, this is a special function that exists on your window object. This will be called by your browser once your document has loaded. Now, I think Sanjaya's question is, well, what if we didn't have this function, just had our code kind of out in the open without outside of the function? In this case, yep. I believe it should work because we are deferring the load of our JavaScript. But if we did not defer, this code would try to run right away, and it would not find our body elements down here. So yeah, you could probably get away with without doing window.onload, because we are deferring the load of the JavaScript to wait until the entire document is loaded. In this case, I like the safety of having a specific function that's going to be called once the document loads. So I think, Sanjay, you're right. You could it probably will work if you don't have this function and just have this code out in the open. But yeah, shouldn't make a difference, I don't think.
All right, thank you.
Yep, good question. Porfi.
Hey, two questions actually. So on your VS Code, I see you have a .vs code file. I was just wondering what that was. It's just I don't get that when I run my VS Code, so I didn't know if it was essential.
Yeah, I think this is because I ran Live Server. So Live Server is a plugin to run HTML files. I think it creates this file. So I didn't create it. This was not from Create React App. This was VS Code just having some information that it wants to use for its running. So yeah, I can actually delete that. It should be fine.
All right.
Yep.
And then the second thing was in the button counter app, I see that the modules one is like grayed out. Does that mean that if we git push it automatically just won't?
Yeah, good question. Yeah, I'm glad you guys are kind of inspecting this. Yeah, I did not mention that. So Create React App comes with a lot of goodies. One thing is that it has a git ignore file for you automatically. So if you kind of scroll through that, you should find node modules as one of the many files ignored by default for your React app. So yeah, Porfi is correct. If you push this project, like create a new React app, add it to a grid project and commit it to your GitHub, node modules is automatically going to be ignored right off the bat. And if you kind of scroll through this, there's a bunch of files that are going to be ignored. So again, it's kind of nice to use create React app because it has everything kind of ready to go for you. A couple other things we can explore. So again, a lot of stuff got downloaded. Let's kind of explore the new files that we got. So hopefully your setup looks something like this. If your Create React app completed, I know based on your internet connection, hopefully it's still not going. But let's actually investigate and get to know all the files that we kind of downloaded, or not all of them, but at least the important ones. So we talked about node modules. Again, if you remember from Node, this is where all the libraries that got downloaded will exist. You should never need to go into this folder. Just trust that everything that needed to be downloaded got downloaded, and you will have access to it through your code if you need it. So again, node modules, you can poke around in there. You can, look to see what's in there, but you should never need to modify anything in there. I never go into the node modules folder really, so we can ignore that. But that's where your libraries are stored. Next up, we can look at the public folder. So the public folder also is not something that we're going to modify. The main highlight of the public folder is that there's an index.html located in here. So again, similar to what we just did before, where we need some HTML page to kind of launch our application in our browser, that's what index.html is doing. We do not edit index.html as developers. We should leave everything in the public folder alone. Again, there are some rare cases where you might want to go into this folder and modify some things, but index.html for the most part, we don't need to touch it. It has everything it needs, and we're not going to work with it. So the most important thing in this index file is this root element. Again, this is not something I've added. This is something that existed. This is how our React app is going to populate our index.html file, because there's a root element here. And we'll kind of see that connection in a bit. But again, main takeaway, the public folder is not for developers. This is just something that React will use, but we don't need to modify it. Any questions about that? Okay, so the interesting thing for developers is located in the SRC folder, also known as the source folder. This is where we will start making our modifications to create our React app. So we open that folder, we should find some goodies in there. To start, there's index.js. This is very similar to the setup that we did before, where we manually created an index.html and an index.js file, and we linked those together. That's what index.js is doing here. It's linking to index.html. So we look at index.js, nothing too much going on here, but this part right here, this is what's actually launching our React part of our application. So this is just a JavaScript file, but we're tying in our React app with this line of code here, or these lines of code right here. Right? Again, same thing with index.html. For the most part, you should never need to modify index.js. Now, again, never say never. There are some rare circumstances where you might want to modify a few things in here, but for the most part, you can leave this as is and not worry about it. So index.html in the public folder, index.js in the source folder, for the most part, you're not going to touch them. Just understand that they exist. They will work from the get-go, so we can ignore them. Now, the first thing that we kind of interact with will be app.js. So this is where we're going to start adding our changes for our React app. So right now, there's some code kind of automatically there. We can actually launch our server and see what this page looks like. So if you want to run your React app, in your command line, you need to navigate to your project. So again, I'm at the React level, or my React folder. I created a full application called button counter app. So I need to cd into that folder. And I need to be on the same level as package.json. So this is an important file. We've not talked about it yet, but you want to be on the same level as package.json, and then run a command of npm start. Just going to pause here for a second. So make sure you are in your app folder that you just created with create React app. Run npm start. Again, you should be on the same level as package.json. So if I did an ls here, I should see package.json, which is right over here. Yep. Right. And then I'm going to run npm start. What this is going to do is launch our React server. So it's going to take a few seconds, hopefully not too long. On the default port is 3000. So if you go to localhost 3000, that should eventually bring up the default React page. This is very similar to Django, where like if we launch a Django project, we saw that rocket that was kind of firing off. You guys remember? This is the default React page. So if you downloaded, create React app correctly, did your npm start in the right location, you should see a page that looks like this. So I'm going to pause here in case anyone's following along. Anyone have any issues getting to this page? So again, you run npm start, you should get some output in your console. Okay. You should see something that says compiled successful, and it'll show you the port you're running on. Now, Windows users, I know you guys might have something a little different. Your port might be different. I'm not quite sure what the differences might be, but it should tell you what port the server's running on. You want to connect a page to it. So navigate to localhost 3000 or whatever your port is. You should see this. Any issues getting to this kind of mesmerizing icon? Okay, since we're talking about Windows users, Elon, you have a question?
Yes, just curious. So can you still do like modify the port you're trying to launch the site, like how you did in Django?
Yes, you do have that option. We'll get into that in a second. I might need to remember it, the syntax for it, but yes, you can control what port it's launched on. So 3000 is the default port, but you can pick pretty much any valid port number that you choose. Another shout out to Windows users, just make sure that you guys pay attention to it. Where is it? Right here. There's a note on our curriculum page. Again, I am not on a Windows machine, so I can't speak for this definitively, but there's a change you will need to make on your computer to get React to work the way it should. You need to add this key value pair. So it looks like CHOKIDAR, no idea what that stands for, use polling equals true. This needs to be set if you want your React server to automatically update when changes are made. This is something that happens on Macs by default. I'm not sure why there's a difference in OS behavior there, but kind of follow this prompt. And if might need to do some Googling to figure out how to exactly do that. But if you are on Windows, you might need to set this setting. All right, if you have trouble with it, maybe we can troubleshoot in the afternoon. But again, I've not done this myself because I'm on a Macintosh, but hopefully you guys don't have too much trouble setting this up. So make sure you find that on the curriculum page and try to figure that out for your Windows system. Okay, Yelin did ask about setting a port. That's a good time to talk about package.json quickly. So this file is very similar to the requirements.txt file that we were using in Django. This file basically contains a summary of all the libraries that this project is using and a few other items of interest. So if I kind of focus on the dependencies section, again, I'm in my package.json dependencies. These are all the libraries that are being used with my application. This is what was automatically set up by Create React App. So notice we're using React version 17.0.2. There's also React DOM, which is another library, React scripts. Web Vitals. I'm not quite sure what that does, but these are all the library and the versions that are for the specific project. Now, again, a year from now, if I ran create React app, my React version is probably going to be different because I'm sure React will update within a year. So again, these are the fixed versions for this project. Very, very similar to how we did a pip freeze and got the requirements.txt created manually. This is automatically created for us. I did not know how to create package.json myself. Now, we created a React app from scratch. If you're going to work on our existing React app, you will need to use package.json to install all the libraries. So if you remember, let me write some notes if I can get a random file here. Let's do notes.md. So when we're working with Django, if you recall, we had to do something like pip install Django, and then we had to create our Django project by doing Django admin, what was it, start project, and then name of proj. Right? If you guys remember, these were the two steps to get a Django project kind of off the ground. For React, it was, I'm not sure writing in hashtags, but whatever. For React, it was simply npx create React app, and then your app name. All right, so these are kind of equivalent. This is to create a React app. This was to create a Django app. So notice we had to install Django ourselves and then create a project. This installs React and creates our application for us in one step. We also normally would do a pip, what was it, freeze, and they had to create the requirements.txt file ourselves, requirements.txt. Right? This was a manual process. We know how to do that here. Package.json is the requirements.txt effectively here. But when we wanted to install from an existing Django project, we did something like pip install tac-r requirements.txt, right? If you guys remember, so if there's an existing requirements.txt, we'd install all the libraries via this command. For React apps, we want to do something similar. We just want to run npm install. That's all we had to run. This will look for a package.json file, so make sure you are in the right directory on the same level as package.json. npm install will go through package.json, install all the dependencies that are required for this project. All right, so just keep that in mind. Hopefully that comparison kind of makes sense. So instead of doing pip install requirements.txt, all we gotta do is npm install on the same level as package.json, and it'll go through package.json and install everything that we need. So this is creating a React app from scratch. This is installing and continuing a React project that's already been created. Any questions so far? Rob?
Does not having package lock.json matter? I didn't get that on the install from the React install.
Yeah, good question. So I believe this gets created when you run npm start. Don't quote me on that, but yeah, you might. The important one is package.json. Package lock.json will automatically be created at some point. So I think if you run your server, this should be created. Yeah, this one has a lot more stuff in it. Again, you never need to bother with package lock.json. You can modify package.json yourself. Like if I want to, introduce a new dependency like donut app, I can add that here manually. Again, there's no donut app, but you can modify package.json if you know what version of something you want to add in. But usually, if you do an npm install, package.json will be updated automatically. So if I did something like, let me get to my terminal. If I happen to want to add a new library to my existing project, I could go into button counter app. I could do an npm install and then some library name. Once I run npm install, this will automatically update this, this dependency section. I don't usually need to manually edit it unless I'm just, specifically manually editing what items should be used without installing them. But if you run npm install with whatever library name, that will automatically update your package.json. It's pretty automatic. So we don't have to keep doing like a pip freeze as we had to do with Django. This will automatically be maintained for us. Okay, any other questions before we get to the more interesting stuff? Okay, so again, just to make sure you understand the file, so node modules has all your libraries in it. Public has some stuff for the front end facing part of our React app. Our core logic is going to go in the source folder. We should locate app.js, and this is where we're going to start editing our application. All right, so right now there's this icon that's spinning. This is a default React page. Let's actually create create some content for ourselves. So I'm going to delete everything between the div here. So I'm going to have div class name app, keep that around. Get rid of that logo. We're not going to use that image. I'm actually going to delete it from my project because I don't like having it around. All right, so app.js, this is our entry point into our React application. App is our topmost node that we're going to be using. We'll talk about components in a second, but components are basically the basic building blocks for React applications. They're very, very similar to our elements in HTML. So how do we create React app? We went through that. What is a component? So a component is essentially, I describe it as a user-defined HTML tag, but really it's much more than that. So if I wanted to kind of instantiate a component, I basically use angle brackets, just like in HTML, the name of my component. So let's say I created a component called Quebec Platoon. I would render that with angle brackets, name of my component. And then just like HTML attributes or elements, you can pass attributes to them. So in this case, I can create an attribute called students, pass it some value. I could also add another attribute called description, pass it some value. Again, there's no limit to the number of attributes you can add to a component. They're basically just variables, if you want to imagine them, that I'm adding to the component. All right, so again, we'll get into the syntax a little bit more, but components, basically custom user HTML defined tags. They allow for easy reusability within React apps. So that's why we want to create components and make our React application very modular. You don't want to write everything in one file. You want to create separate files for them. Important thing is that our component must return JSX code. Now, you guys might be asking, well, what is JSX? Probably a good question. JSX stands for JavaScript XML. This is something that I describe as a marriage syntax between HTML and JavaScript. Now, we've kind of seen this already when we were working with Django. So you remember Django had a templating syntax that basically married HTML and Python together, right? We were able to create template files that look like HTML, but we're able to use specific syntax to kind of embed Python logic within our HTML templates. That's the same concept of JSX, but instead of Python, we're going to be inserting JavaScript right into our HTML kind of logic there. So again, JSX can include normal HTML elements. So the first example here, this is just a standard HTML element that we've seen before. We have an A tag with an href and then some value here. If you want to render a component, as we talked about, same syntax. We use angle bracket, name of the component. So instead of using A, which is an HTML element tag, we use my component, which is going to be something we're going to create and then specify whatever values that we want to specify. The third thing is we can embed JavaScript. And the way we do that is by just inserting curly braces. Again, we don't have to worry about curly braces with percent signs. That was Django syntax. We just add in curly brace blocks and then add JavaScript right in there. So let's say I had a variable called JS counter. I could increment that counter in my JSX code by doing curly brackets, name my variable, and accessing it and doing whatever I want with it inside these curly braces. All right, so this is what JSX will look like. You can have HTML elements, React components, or straight up JavaScript inside of curly braces. All right, so let's actually go back to our application that we were creating. Again, I deleted everything inside my app component, kept the div. Here, let's just add a simple HTML tag. I'm going to do h2 and say hello world. All right, notice this looks just like HTML, but this is actually JSX. I know the distinction is very hard to see here because all of this looks like HTML. But what I'm actually returning here is JSX. So maybe put a note in here, returning JSX code. So this code, although it looks like HTML, is basically what we wrote before. So I kind of regret deleting what we had before. But if I go back to what we were doing before, remember we had to write all this out before to create new elements and then eventually add them to our DOM. This is what the JSX is doing behind the scenes. So I am not writing all this JavaScript, but my JSX is going to be converted to JavaScript automatically by the React engine. So I don't need to create nodes like this and add IDs and inner text, whatever I'm doing here. I can just do that all in one place. So here I'm creating a brand new H2 element, adding in some inner text, and then again, rendering it inside of a div. This is going to be boiled down in JavaScript and then eventually added to the DOM. So if I made this change right here and go back to my browser, notice that I have hello world right here. So again, this is that automatic updating feature of React. Any changes you make to your React code, it's going to be automatically updated on your browser. So that's kind of, developer friendly. I don't need to keep relaunching or refreshing my page. Any changes I make, so let's say I make a change of, add a bunch of exclamation marks. Notice I just saved my page. That automatically updates. So it's kind of nice. Again, if you're on Windows, you might need to tweak a couple settings, as we talked about before, but kind of nice to have that automatically updating for us. All right, so if we went back to our example that we start off with, where we just had JavaScript and we had HTML, what if we want to recreate that within our React app? What would we need to do? So I'm just going to copy the code from our curriculum page, just because I don't want any typos. We'll talk about it and definitely get more practice writing React, but I'm just going to copy what we had on our curriculum page to see what the code looks like in comparison. So to do the same exact thing we did before with that button counter, I'm going to copy some code, drop it right here. So copy it all. All right, so this is the new code versus the old code. So let me bring that code back. Sorry for deleting. And so we had index.js that we wrote ourselves. And just to compare what it looks like, let me copy that code back. All right, so this is what we wrote before, right? If you remember all of our JavaScript that we copied in, versus this is what our app looks like. So let's split screen that and kind of compare, contrast, and see which one we think is easier to understand. So on the left side, we have our React app. Oops. Left side, we have our index.js. On our right side, we have our React app. So notice we're doing the same exact thing. I could prove that to you by showing right here. This is our button counter app. Obviously, the alignment looks a little different, but this is the same thing. I click this button, stuff gets counted. So we have achieved the same exact thing in our React app, but this is our code for our React app right here, compared to all the JavaScript we had to write over here. So these 3 lines of code right here, this is JSX, is effectively doing everything that I've done right here. Now, again, we do have a counter. So again, there's some new syntax here. We'll get to it in a second, but we still need a counter. So we create a counter. We need to increment our counter. Again, the magic, the logic can't just magically go away. But aside from that, we have a function to update our counter. We have our counter variable, and then we have exactly what we want to see on our screen. The reason why JSX is so much more developer friendly is because I literally want to create H2 tags or a button or a paragraph. So I just write the HTML effectively that I want to see. Now, again, this is not pure HTML. This is JSX. I'm allowed to kind of insert JavaScript variables inside of my JSX here. So notice the increment counter is a function. I am referring to that function inside of curly brackets because I'm using JavaScript there. Same thing with counter. Counter is a JavaScript variable. I'm using that right here in curly braces. Inside of my JSX, I'm referring to a JavaScript value right here. So anytime that counter updates, it's going to update my output right here. All right, so again, the old JavaScript way right here on the left, the new React way on the right here. I would say much easier, much quicker to develop, and that's kind of the benefit of React. Rob, you have a question?
Yeah, what does the import use state from React do again?
Great question. I did not talk about that, so we will get to that. There are some, again, React-specific ways to maintain values. We're going to get to what use state is doing, but if you guys can accept it right now, just understand that this is how we create variables within React. Again, it is new syntax, so we'll get to it. But effectively, I'm creating a new variable, and I need to use this magical use state function. So this is importing it from the React library so that I can use it in my function here. All right, so again, old way, new way. Let's focus on React. So I'm gonna get rid of the old way. But hopefully you guys can see the parallels again, right here, creating a new header app or new header element. That's the same thing that's going on right here, just much easier to kind of write in React. I guess in this case, yeah. All right. So that can go away. Let's go focus on React from here on out. All right, so we create a very simple application here where we can click a button and it counts up. But again, I kind of glazed over a lot of React specific items. So let's actually take a deeper dive into the code that we just wrote. All right, so let's start off with what we have right now. Let's go line by line. So at the very top, we're importing app.css. This is a file that automatically exists when you create your initial React app. As you might imagine, this is our default application styling. So if you go into app.css, these are the styles that are being used with our application. So notice there's text align center. That's why our text was aligned, in the middle to start off with. There's also, the app header that we had. I think this was for the spinning icon, right? It's just an image, but you can add some transitions or transformations using CSS. So that's what was controlling that spinning icon. I'm gonna get rid of this because I don't really want most of this and delete that CSS. But if I want to add some new styling, like let's say I want to add inside my body tag, I want to make all my text green for some reason. Again, CSS, we've done this before, but this is where your main CSS items can go. So let's make that green, as I said. Let's pick a green. Body, I need a body element, don't I? So I need to target something here. Let's target this div. So we have app already, so I'm gonna go with that. Put color up here. Let's make that green, as I said. So PD 00. It's gonna be a bright green. Let's make that darker. Okay, so we have a dark green, hopefully here. All right, so we get green. You look here. There we go. We got some green text. So again, CSS still in the mix here. If you want to do any styling, React does not replace all of that functionality. CSS is still going to exist here. All right, I'm going to slow down here in case anyone's trying to follow along or has any questions. But again, we include app.css within our app.js so that we have that styling available if we need it. What else? All right, second line here. We are importing something from the React library. Again, this is something that exists in our node modules folder. So if you really wanted, you could dig into the React folder in the node modules. So if I look for that, it's going to be way down here. There should be a React folder. Here, there's that React folder. So we're importing something from here. Again, there's a lot of files to go through, so I'm not going to bother finding where use state is coming from. Just understand this is a function that exists in our React library. That's what we're importing. I saw a hand raise. Sorry, I missed who it was.
Oh, yeah, I was just going to ask something. I don't know if it's that important, but I was just wondering about the IDs. Usually in JavaScript, I've seen it like in the context of creating elements and things like that. Do you see that a lot in React as well, or do you see like classes more likely?
I'd say the same rules apply for HTML and React. Again, usually good practice to give IDs to each of your elements. Now, in theory, like if you have like 100 different elements, can kind of get tedious and annoying. So usually I will create IDs if I specifically know I need to target them somehow, whether it be through CSS or even through React. That's when I add IDs. Class name, same rule. If you need to apply some class styling for CSS, then yeah, you want to add a class name. So one distinction I should make right here, just because I remember, there are a few changes you need to make. So normally, if you remember in HTML, this div would just have class, right? In HTML, you write, your element name and then class and whatever class you want to apply to it. You cannot use class in JSX because that is a reserved keyword in JavaScript. So a slight difference in JSX, if you want to apply a class to an element, you need to write class name. So that's why you're going to see class name instead of class. So again, if this were HTML, you just see class equals whatever. In JSX, you need to use class, uppercase, and name to define classes for your elements. So a few distinctions. Again, this is not HTML, this is JSX. So make sure you understand the differences here. Okay, let's continue on. So we're using something called use state. This is probably a good time to talk about state values. So If we go in our slides, continue on. These are the two most important kind of concepts or values within React. So pretty simple. There's two things to worry about here: states and props. States are internal data values for a component. So a component is what we created over here. So this entire thing is a component. The name of this component is app. And inside of there, we create state values. So this is an example of a state value. So again, this is an internal value for this component. On the other hand, we have something called props, which is kind of the opposite. There are external data values that come into our component. We have not seen an example of props just yet, so stay tuned for that. But understand, when I refer to state values, that means I'm referring to a data value that is part of a component. If I refer to a prop value, that means it's a data value coming from somewhere else, usually from a parent component passed down to a child component. And we'll see both examples of both of these in a second. Right? So let's go back to our code. So here is a state value. So we need to learn about this useState function, also known as useState hook, and why we need to use this. It takes a while to understand why I can't just do something like const counter, right? A lot of you guys might be thinking, well, why can't you just create a counter value here? This is not going to work well with React. And we're going to see this in a second. We need to specifically use the useState function for React to kind of work with our logic. Or I guess maybe said a better way, we need to use useState to work with React's logic. We cannot just create a local variable if we want to use that variable part of our render. So the parts of a component here, we can have some state values. Again, we don't have to have state values. We might have some additional functions. In this case, I have one event handler function. You're going to want to return something from each component. So as we talked about, we need to return JSX code. So this return statement is going to return some JSX code out of this component. So this looks like a normal function. And I understand you're like, well, why are you calling this a component and not just a function? The reason is React is going to use this specifically as a component. So you need the specific syntax for a component in there. Specifically, you need to return JSX from this function that we've created. So this is a function, yes, but this is a functional, or let's say function-based React component. So yes, it is a function, but it is a specific type of function that acts as a component. That component must return JSX. So that's what we're returning at the very end here. John Price, question?
Yeah, okay. Is there a link to the slides that you're referencing so I can like write down the information from the slides while you're going over the code?
I can link that later. Sorry, I don't have that right now. But again, a lot of these notes
should be in today's lecture.
Yeah, there are different slides linked at the very top. So these are not the slides I'm going off of. So React slide up here. Sorry, I'm on the wrong screen. Yeah, sorry, the slides I'm using are not these slides, but these have good information in them also. So they should cover states and props also. And we have notes on the page, so apologies for not having those slides available. But all right, so where are we in our page here? Andrew Tran, question.
When you said it must return JSX code, can you return like I don't remember what it's called in JavaScript, like the Python equivalent of pass?
You can return nothing. So if you want to if you want your component to return nothing, you can render literally nothing. I could put return null here. So this component will maybe do some work, but on the screen, it's not going to show up in any physical space because this is saying no, additional items get added to the DOM here. So all the stuff that I had here, this is what's getting added to the DOM and eventually shown on the page. So yes, you can return nothing if you want to. That's probably rare, but you have that option.
Hey, Anchor, what's the deal with set counter? Like, why do we need two variables?
Great question. So I think we probably are due for a break here. So after the break, we're going to talk about state values. If you guys want to kind of read ahead on them, we have a nice paragraph over here, but we're going to understand exactly what useState is doing and why we need to use it. I know we have not answered those questions yet, We're going to see that after the break. So I'm glad you guys are asking great questions. It is 10:26. All right, so if you were following along, this is what we copy and pasted from the curriculum page. Again, not going to do too much more copy and pasting here. We're going to be typing from here on out. But just want to understand, this is our initial app here. This has we've implemented a click counter that tracks how many times we click this random button here. Let's kind of run down what we have right now. We still have some things to discuss, specifically what state values are doing. But on a high level, this is a component. So everything I've highlighted here, this is our component called app. This is our topmost component for our React application. Kind of backtracking a bit to make sure we understand the connections. We have an index.html page. All right. We have our index.html page in our public folder. This is our main HTML file. This is linked with our index.js file. So we look at this file. This is kind of the connection between our HTML file and our React application. We are rendering a component right here. So I could add some comments here. Again, normally we don't want to modify this file, but comments don't hurt. So app is our component in app.js. When we want to render it, we use angle brackets, just like an HTML element. That's how we render our component here. So this is creating an instance of our app component, and it is combining it or nesting it within our root element. So where's this root element? Again, that's coming from our index.html page. So if you remember index.html, which I keep losing here, it specifically has a div called root. This is where everything's going to be inserted right here. So if I put stuff goes here, again, I'm just adding comments. I'm not modifying this file really, but this is the root element, and this is where all of our React stuff will go in between here. So we have roots, we are targeting that root element and then inserting all this good stuff from our app. So app is where we actually start adding in our logic. So this app component, we're specifically saying what that component is going to render. Specifically, everything I've highlighted here, we're going to create a new div called app, H2 element, button element, and paragraph element. So whatever I'm returning from my app component is what eventually gets added to the DOM. Now, again, keep in mind, this is JSX, not quite HTML, but eventually it will look like HTML on the other side. So if we actually go to our application here, bring up the property inspector. So I'm going to do, Option Command I in Chrome. Actually look at the elements for this page. Notice what we have here. Notice we have that root element right here, right? This is from our HTML file. We open that up and notice that we have a div called div with a class name app. If you recall where that came from, let's hop back. Notice I have a div right here with class name app. Again, the difference here is you got to use class name instead of class for JSX. We have a div here. So if I look in my HTML page here, we have a div called with a class name app. Further down, notice we have an H2 element right here. We have a button element. These are all the things that essentially our component set to create, and that's what eventually got created in our HTML file. We also have this paragraph element, which has some text in it. So notice that this is just text. There's no variable here, right? In our JSX, we had a counter variable, but here it's just the actual value that is displayed on the HTML page. So this is all HTML, nothing magical going on here, but the magic is between React, where we tell it exactly what we want to show, and that it's converted to HTML eventually for the browser. Any questions about any of that? Okay, so the main thing we want to focus on right now is using state values. So right now, we're not going to use props. Let's focus on state values. What is useState? Why do we need to use it? How do we use it? Etc. All those questions. So first thing is useState. Oh, Andrew, question?
Yeah, I had a quick question. So you name your function and the class name the same exact thing. Is that like a best practice or is it a bad practice?
Right here?
Yeah.
I'm going to say that's coincidental in this case.
Okay.
You can name this whatever you want. but this is the standard kind of naming for the app component, so I just didn't change it.
Okay.
Yeah, I wouldn't say it's standard practice. Again, you could create whatever class names you want. Your component name does not need to match it. All right, state values. So what's going on here? So inside of our component, we have what we're rendering. What we're rendering depends on certain values. So notice that we are using counter here, and we're also referencing increment counter. These are two JavaScript items that we've created above. The way React works is anytime any one of these items change, if counter changes or increment counter changes, React will automatically re-render this component and try to detect the differences. So for example, if counter gets incremented by 1, this value is going to be different. React should know that it changed, and therefore it's going to try to re-render this entire thing. Now, if you want to get into more of the nitty-gritty of React, one benefit is that it saves developer time by making it much more easier to kind of create elements that you want. The second benefit of React, and probably maybe the primary benefit, is that it's really, really efficient. Meaning, if only one thing changed here, React is not going to refresh your entire page. Let's say this is the only thing that changed. React is smart enough, it has a diffing algorithm to compare what is on your screen versus what it wants to update to, and it'll only update that portion of your screen. It does not refresh your entire page. And that is a big performance improvement, especially if you have a lot of content on a page. You don't want to refresh that entire page, right? If you have a bunch of images, but they're all going to be static, but you have like some text that's updating, React will specifically update that part of your page, not your entire page. And that's really something that's really cool about React. So again, if you want to learn more about it, you could Google React diffing algorithm and learn a lot more about it. The simple summary of that is React knows what to update and only updates that on your page, not your entire page each time something changes. So in this case, anytime that counter changes, React wants to update our component. But the key caveat here is we need to tell React that something has changed. And the way we do that is by using useState. So the difference here, let's say I had a variable called other counter. This is a local variable to my function. There's a few issues with that. Like I could create, a local variable. We've done this before. If I update this value, React does not automatically know that I've updated this value. We need to follow React's guidelines to work with React's frameworks so that React can do the work for us. So that's why we need to use something called useState. So let's dig more deeply into this. useState is a React function that returns two values, right? The first value is your state's value. So whatever you want your state to equal, that's what it returns. So in this case, we have useState, this is initial value, and then it's going to set that to counter. So it's effectively like we're creating a variable like this. So I'm doing other count equals 0. This is effectively what the first part is doing here. We're creating a new variable called counter. So let's say create new variable and set initial value. All right, so the first value here is our new name of our new variable. We can name this whatever we want as long as we follow, naming guidelines. So I can name this counter, can name this donuts, can name this whatever I choose it to be named. This value right here is the initial value for that variable. So let's say input initial value of state. All right, so this value right here is the initial value for this variable. It's the same thing as if I was creating a local variable like this. However, useState returns two items. One is the value, and you want to assign it to some variable. The second is an updating function that we must call. All right, and this part's important. This is actually a function. We are naming that function to be set counter. Again, this is just another variable. We can name this literally anything else we want to. It does not need to match this name. We can name this set something, that's fine. By naming conventions though, usually you want to create a variable and create a function that's set and the name of that. So I'm going to do set counter. Again, this is just naming conventions, but again, this function can be whatever I want, and it's going to work. It's a variable name. But understand that this is pointing to a function or referring to a function, not just some value. All right, so this is a value. In this case, I'm setting that value to be 0. This is a function that I should call when I want to update this value. All right, so again, I'm going to name this more appropriately. I'm going to call this set counter so I know exactly what it's used for. So this is a function I'll use. Now, you might have questions in your head of, well, why do I need to do it this way? Why can't I just create a variable and then do, other counter? I can type other counter equals 1, right? Why can't we just do it this way? The answer is because React needs to know when we update these values, because React is depending on updating our render for us. So counter is part of our render right here. Therefore, we need to use a state value so that whenever the state value is updated by calling set counter, React will automatically re-render our component. Yilin?
So just to make sure the set counter naming, the format, does it has to follow like set and follow with whatever name you use in the previous value?
For naming conventions, yes. But again, this is just naming. This is a naming of a variable. So you can name it whatever you want, but by tradition, call it set and then the name of the variable. So it does not have to be set whatever, but you should name it that way just because that's how all documentation has it too.
Okay, thank you.
So let's make sure we know this. This is not the way to create state values. And let's actually see this in play. So if we're going to connect the dots here, anytime we click our button, that's going to call our increment counter function, which is calling set counter and then passing the new value of counter. So passing the new value of counter. So we're incrementing by 1. So that's what we're doing here. Now let's actually see this in play. What if I had other counter like this? And I did other counter equals other counter plus 1. Let's console log other counter. And then let's console log, sorry, other counter, and then console.log counter. Let's just console log that counter. So this is a state value. And this is just some local variable. All right, so to highlight this, I'm going to create a new paragraph. I don't really care what the ID is. This one might be unique. So let's get rid of the IDs. I don't think we need them right now. So in this case, I'm going to use counter, which is a state value. In this case, I'm going to use other counter, which is a local variable. Let's see how they behave differently. All right, so again, other counter is a local variable. Counter is a state value. And then we're going to print those out each time increment counter is called. And let's see how our render kind of behaves here. So I'm going to save this. Refresh this maybe. All right, so notice we have 2 paragraphs. The first one's using a state value. The second one's using our local variable. All right, each time I click this button, we should see something in our console. So console is empty right now. Let's click this button and see what happens. Sorry, one more change. Let's make sure we know what we're printing out. So let's say other counter. And then this is counter. All right, so local variable first, and then the state value second. Let's actually see how these are behaving. So I click and assign it to constant variable. That's my bad. That should not be constants. Let's try that again. All right, notice we get some values here. So other counter is 1. Sorry, this is going to be a little confusing. Give me 1 second. I'm going to print out counter plus 1 here, and we'll talk about why I had to do that. I'm going to switch these orders just to align them with the paragraph. So again, counter is used here, other counter is used here. So counter plus 1 is going to be the new value I'm setting. other counter is what I've already updated. And it'll make sense in a second. All right, so let's refresh this and try one more time. So click me. Counter is 1, other counter is 1, right? We click this button one time, but notice what the output is showing. The state value is correctly showing that I've clicked this one time. The second value, which was using other counter, notice it still says 0, even though other counter in my console is shown to be 1, right? Let's click it again. Notice another thing here. Counter has gone to 2, and it's reflected here because it's a state value. Other counter is still 1. The reason it's 1 is because each time this function is called, other counter gets set to 0, and then we increment it by 1. So React calls this function each time. This is, again, just like any other function that you're used to in JavaScript. This means other counter is going to be created each time and set to 0, meaning it's not going to maintain its value across function calls, right? So one alternate thing we could do is, what if we push this to the global scope and said, all right, we're going to keep track of our counter up here. Well, this will solve one problem in that, oops. This will solve one problem in that counter will not always reset to 0. So it should keep track of the count between function calls, but it's still not going to fix our rendering right here. So let's actually see this here. Click the button. All right, other counter and counter are 1. That works. All right, so this lets us update. Notice that other counter is being updated, but this is a global variable. The problem here is, what if I want to have multiple counters? Like if I want multiple instances of app, right? Let's say I want 2 different buttons and 2 different counters. This is a global variable. This is shared between every instance of app, and that's not what we want. So this is a global variable. Andrew, do you have a question, or was that from before?
Yeah, it was from before, but I do have a question. Your constant counter set counter, I feel like I forgot my JavaScript. Is it in a list?
Yeah, we're storing it in a list because useState is returning 2 values, I assume, as a list. I don't know if we can check that, but yeah, it's passing back again a value and a function. And yeah, we're storing that as a list, but we can access that freely outside of it. It is kind of weird syntax, but this is just allowing us to capture 2 values from useState.
Okay, so you can still access counter and set counter outside of that list. It's just gets stored in the list.
Yep. All right, so the reason we don't want to use a global value is because what if we render app twice? Which we can do. If I actually go to index.js, what if I, it's gonna get a little messy, but create a div, create app twice. So I wanna have 2 different instances of my app. This is totally allowed. This is the whole point of components. Or if I want to have 2 different button counters, I can create 2 instances of app here. So now let's see if this actually works. Okay, so notice I have 2 different applications. This is one app component, and this is a second app component. Now, if I click this right here, notice that my counters go up. This is the global value. This is the state value. Notice here, I have a problem. I clicked this button one time, but this jumped to 5. Why did that jump to 5? Well, because this global value is being shared between these 2 instances. That's not really what I want, right? I want these to be independent of one another. So if I click this, a bunch of times, notice that I have a global counter that's being shared between these 2. My state values are unique to each. I've clicked this 10 times. That's what's reported here. I clicked this button 13 times. That's what this being reported here. So this value is correct. These values are not correct. Notice that they're kind of hopping around in weird ways. Another thing you might notice this is actually correct between summing up 17 and 18, right? Let's make these easier values to look at. So here I've clicked this 25 times and this button 20 times. So this value is correct, but notice that this never got updated. This is still at 37. And this goes back to what React wants us to do. We need to tell React, hey, you are depending on some value right here. Your render depends on some values. React needs to be notified that that value has actually changed. So although other counter is being manually changed right here, React has no idea. This is just a local variable. React has no knowledge of this value changing. Andrew Simpson.
Could you go back to your browser real quick?
Sure.
What are those? It looks like in your console, you have like two things with like a purple React logo that says components and profiler. What is that actually?
This is kind of useful to use with React. I'm not sure if I installed anything extra. If you guys don't have it, I might need to figure out what I installed, but this kind of gives you a more React appropriate kind of panel to investigate certain things. So if I go through this, I'm sure I could find more useful information. Notice it has a state value. So 25 is a state value. Does that update? So it's not update. Oh, it does update. Cool. I'm not sure how I got this here. So if you don't have it, I might need to remember what I installed.
Okay, cool.
Sorry. Yep. But I don't use that too often. Console log is usually good enough. But all right, so we see the problem of just using local variables or global variables. That is why we should be using state values. So again, state values, if we can add on to our notes here, state values are retained between function calls. So this gets created one time, and then each successive call to my app function, it's not going to recreate the state value. It's going to reuse the existing state value that I created the first time. So that's state is doing that kind of management for us. It's going to retain a value between function calls. We don't want a global value. We don't want a local value like we had before. State is a React appropriate way to create internal values that are retained inside of that component. Andrew Tran, you're giving me some weird looks. So
I'm trying to think about what you're saying, because you're saying the state value is not a global, but when you're calling it as a state value within like your component, it almost functions as a global value between apps.
It's not a global value. So global means anyone has access to it. A state value is only accessible by that component. So it's internal to this component and it's retained. That's the important thing about state values. The value is retained inside of that component.
When you say
go ahead.
Component in this case is the function, right?
Yeah, so this entire thing is a component. I kind of lost my ability to highlight everything, but yes, everything inside this function right here, this is my app component.
So if you had function app2, that state would not move over to that app.
Correct, yes. Counter is not accessible outside of this, this scope, basically. So state values are retained between function calls. That is, again, the magic of using useState. That all that management is done by React, but you need to use this function to kind of initialize a value for that. So again, useState will pass you back the value, which you store in a variable, and also a function that you need to use to update that value. And we haven't talked about why we need this function. So let's actually get to that now. I'm gonna get rid of other counter. Hopefully we understand that's not the way to go here. So other counter is gonna disappear. Let's talk about this function. So notice set counter is the variable that I've stored the function in. I'm calling this just like like any other function I would want to call. So set counter is a function or referencing a function. I pass it some value. That's going to be the new value of counter. Important things to know here. Set counter is asynchronous. This means I am calling this function, but there is no guarantee that it's going to complete by the time I get to the next line. So to highlight this, what if I do a console log of counter right here? All right, so looking at this on face value, you might think, all right, you're calling some function to update counter, and then you're printing out counter. Should this be the new value? Right, we're calling a function to update counter, so that's going to eventually update counter right here, and then we're printing out counter. Let's take a look at this and see what we get in the output. So we call this counter. All right, so let's run this. Other counter not defined, that is my bad. So another good thing about React, it'll give you nice error messages. It says, hey, app.js line 35, other counter does not exist, which makes sense. We deleted other counter. So get rid of that paragraph tag right here. Okay, but our focus right now is here. When we click this button, increment counter gets called. We want to update the value of counter and then see what the value is right here. So All right, we have 2 apps. Let's get rid of that app. I don't want 2 apps. I just want 1 app right now. Okay, we're back to 1. So if I click this, there's something interesting going on here. Notice that my count is up to 5, and I did click this button 5 times. So this is correct. But notice what my counter value is right here. It's actually lagging behind by 1. And the reason is because the updating function is asynchronous. Again, so to highlight that, I call in app.js. This is not going to immediately apply. This is eventually going to apply. So eventually update the value of counter, but not immediately. Hopefully all these notes make sense. So basically what we're doing here is scheduling an update with React. We're saying, React, we have a new value for you. Please update this when you are good and ready. React does not operate on our schedule. It has its own schedule that it operates on. So we're scheduling a change to say, hey, the new value of counter should be counter +1. And that will eventually update. Again, keyword eventually, not immediately. So at this point in time, counter is going to be set to, it's going to still be the old value because that update does not go through immediately. So that's something very important to keep in mind here. This is asynchronous and this trips up a lot of new developers. Know that you're not going to have access to the new value right away. It gets a little trickier with React, and we're going to learn how to deal with that in the future. We're not going to deal with that right now, but the answer to this is React lifecycles. So each component has a lifecycle, and you can kind of understand that when something updates, how to react to that through some other mechanism. We're not going to cover that today. That's much more complicated. But React component lifecycle is the answer to, hey, how do you know when we actually can actually access this new value? We cannot access it right here. This is the old value, not the new value. But the important thing that we should note is whenever this update does go through, only then will React try to re-render our component. So we schedule a change. When that scheduled change actually happens, only then will React go like, all right, cool, something changed. Let me try to figure out what your new render should look like. All right, so whenever this counter actually updates in React's world, it will re-render our component and try to understand what needs to update on the screen. I'm going to pause here in case there are questions that are lurking in the audience. So a lot to process, I understand, but the high level of it is we must use this useState function to create state values, which will be retained within our component. And also we can use this function, we must use this function to update our value. Now, if you want to see, again, what bad things happen if we don't, we have our state value, counter is a state value. What if I manually update it? All right, I'm not going to call set counter. Let's see what happens here. Console log. I feel like I delete code and I always want it back. All right, so we're going to update counter and console log it. The question is, well, what's our rendering? What's our behavioral rendering? How is React going to respond to this? So we have our state value. Save this, refresh this. Okay, we're back to 0. Start clicking, constants. Do that again. All right, so refresh. All right, notice counter is updating correctly. I've clicked this 5 times and counter is up to 5. I click this, 5 more times, should be up to 10. So our value is being updated. There's no error being thrown here. You are allowed to update variables freely, but you shouldn't update state values kind of directly. Again, that goes back to our PSA from the beginning. You should not, this is directly modifying a state value. This is bad. Let's make sure we understand that. Bad, bad, bad. Because React does not know we're updating this. In order for React to know we're updating something, we need to use that function that we created above right here. So without calling that function, our value updates, that's a thumbs up. But our render, React never knows to re-render our component because it doesn't think counter has changed from its perspective. So here it's gonna be like, all right, counter is still equal to 0. I have nothing to re-render here. So that's why my display still says you click this button 0 times, even though my value behind the scenes is updating. Questions?
I've got one, Ankur. Could you go back to your code real quick?
Sure.
It has to do with your, could you go up a little bit?
Sure.
I'm just trying to understand what the let counter set counter is fully doing. So how does counter notice start at 0? Is that the argument that you put into use state?
Yep.
Okay. And set counter is a function. So we're really defined. Set counter is really a function being defined by the second value returned from use state.
So yeah, this is a function that we are storing in a variable. So yes, this is effectively referring to a function. We can treat it like a function, as we saw right here. We can call it with a new value.
And within that, you can use whatever logic you want within like the parentheses that you're currently on, right?
This is going to be a value. So whatever I want counter to be set to, instead of doing this, again, this is bad, bad, bad. This is the good way to do it. We are going to say, this is the new value of counter. React updates this value for us. We should not directly update counter ourselves.
And just real quick while you're typing it, the bigger picture is like the use state has to be used because when we have the use state, it automatically calls on React's like parser to check for changes.
Use state, again, use state the only thing use state is doing is initializing two variables. That's all it's doing. Use state is initializing a counter and creating some function that will, yes, be used behind the scenes by React to know that, hey, counter is being updated. I need to update my render. It's not doing really much more than that. It's just initializing a state variable, and understand a state variable is maintained by React and used for rendering. Any confusion there?
No. I think you clarified it when you said like the state variable is something being used by React. So React automatically changes when it knows that a state variable is being changed.
Exactly, and that's why
is the main thing behind it.
Yes, that's why we want to use state values, so that if we need a value in our render, it must be a state value, so that when we update it, React will update its render. If we use local variables, React's not going to know to update the render because of that. So that, again, this is another reason why we should be using the state value, the function we get returned, because if we manually directly update the value, that's not going to be an error, but React is not going to refresh the view. So this is bad because React, I don't know what I was writing here. Yeah, don't update state value directly because React won't know. Right, so doing it directly is allowed, but should never be done because React will not know that's been updated. That's why we call a function that alerts React like, hey, something's changing. You're going to need to potentially update the display. Right, I want to make sure we don't glaze over this, but also don't want to spend too much time on it. Any questions about using the updating function? Again, that function comes back from use state, and we must call it to update. Anytime we want to update counter, we pass it the new value of counter. So if I want counter to be like 7 all the time, I just pass it the new value of 7, and then it's going to be stuck at 7 each time. But again, that's not a good counter. We want to increment counter each time. So that's why we use the old value counter, add 1 to it. That's the new value that counter will be set to eventually. Again, eventually, because it's asynchronous. So this is still going to show the previous value of counter. I know these are a lot of notes to keep track of, but hopefully they make sense. I saw a raised hand. Want to make sure we get questions. Courtney?
Use state is just a function, so we can reuse it on multiple different variables within the same app, right?
Yeah, so we have not done that, but we can create multiple state values. So as many state values as you need, sky's the limit. So I could say, other equals set other. And then you can, again, pass it any data type you want. So we use an integer here. I can make this a string, like hello world. So yeah, these are just variables. I mean, the syntax is a little weird, but effectively we're just creating new variables, but they're special variables in terms of their state values within our React component. But otherwise, for the most part, they are just variables that we are creating. Okay, Jake, question?
Yeah, so it looks like set counter is it's not actually ever truly defined on its own, and it's like nested inside of another function. So how does use state note, does it just look everywhere for something with that name and then use whatever like the logic inside the parentheses are? You don't actually have to define something to use it in use state?
Well, so use state is doing a lot of kind of magic behind the scenes. Effectively, if you want to kind of picture it, use state is saying, let's create a made up use state function. So let's say we're writing our own use state function. It's probably doing something like this: function use state initial value. It's going to do two things. It's going to return initial value, but then also return updating function. So updating function is going to look something like this. Again, this isn't truly what React's doing, but we create a new function, call it updating func. And that's going to take in new value. And then it's going to say, all right, so this is, again, very simplified what use state is probably doing. It's creating a new value and setting the initial value that you pass in. So right here, we pass in 0. So it's going to set 0 to some value here. And it's going to return both the variable we created and the updating function. This updating function that I've not named correctly is going to allow us to pass a new value, assign that value to the state value, which is the same variable that we created before. And it's going to do some magic where it's going to alert React and say, hey, something updated. So this is what the updating function that we're calling effectively. So we're returning that here. Whenever we want to use it, it's going to call into this function and say, all right, what's the new value of state value? Let's alert React that something's changed. Does that make it any more clear, or did I add more confusion?
Yeah, sort of. So it's not, this isn't really a matter of hoisting. This is like, there's like update, or what is it? Set counter is sort of defined and hidden in use state.
Yep. Yeah, that's a better way to think about it. So again, use state will create that function and pass it back to us. We just need to store it in our component here so that we could use it inside this component. So
Okay,
again, it's going to return a list with the value and the function. We are just storing that in our variable and another variable. And then we can
Okay,
call that
thank
function
you.
as we want. Yep, I like the question. Again, this is a simplification of what use state is probably doing behind the scenes. Rob?
Yeah, I might have missed it, but why again, if you'll scroll up, why again do we need to create an event handler instead of just using set counter if it's a function that's updating the counter itself?
That's a good question. In this case, we don't have to create this kind of middleman function. We could, and let's just do this for a good example. We could just call set counter right off the bat. So right here, instead of having a function, we could create an anonymous function that says simply set counter +1. This would work. If that's all we want to do, we need to create some function that's going to be called. And this is another huge distinction I want to make, because a lot of early developer mistakes I see is calling a function versus passing a reference to a function. So it's not easy to see here, but I guess if I do it this way, this is wrong. This is not going to work the way you want it to. What the code you have here right now is when this is executing line by line, when it gets to this line right here, it's going to immediately call set counter. We don't want to invoke the function immediately. We want the onClick handler to call a function when that event happens. So what this is going to do, let's actually take a look and find out. Actually, we're going to infinite loop here, so that's not going to work. But this is going to call an update counter right away. We don't want that. We want this to be a function that is called when this event happens. So to do that, we can write an anonymous function. Hopefully you guys haven't forgotten about those. This is saying create a new function, and that function will be called, and this is what's going to be executed when that function gets called. So again, anonymous functions, get used to them. They are really handy, and you're going to see them often. But to simplify it, increment counter here, this lets us do additional stuff like console logging, whatever else we want to do. So increment counter. So again, notice right here, I am not calling my function. Notice I do not have parentheses here. this would call this immediately and run that right away. That's not what we want. We want to just pass it the name of the function that should be called when this event happens. Again, so I've seen this many times. You guys are probably going to accidentally add parentheses here. You'll be like, hey, it's not working. It's super small here, but the distinction is huge. We don't want to call a function immediately. We want it to be called later on. Rob, did that answer your question? Yes. So we could call set counter directly here if you wanted to.
Gotcha. Yeah, that does. Thank you.
Lyman.
So I was wondering, like another example, you think like, could you also say like have a form field, like say you're typing in the form field, but then you like as you're typing it in, you can render the actual characters in real time on the screen?
Yes, we could do that.
Using state management, kind of, I wonder if that might be another useful way to see like the value of the state management. Maybe some people trying to click and understand like what exactly the value of it is.
So you lost me on the last part. So I'm having.
I was just thinking of another way to demonstrate state outside of just keeping track of a single numerical value, or being, you know, that way they can see like as you're inputting or changing data and how it gets rendered in the experience while you're doing it.
Yeah, if you want to see a little more, let's have an input field. Hopefully this isn't too off the track. So this is going to be type text. This is going to have an on change handler. So a lot of this is going to be Googling, figuring out which events exist for which controls. So inputs have an on change event that can be fired. Whenever the user changes the input value, on change will trigger. So we could have display text. All right, so just get more practice creating state values. Let's create a new state value called user text. And then my updating function, just by convention, I'm going to name it set user text. Initially, it's going to be an empty string. And then let's just say I want to show what they typed. Oops. So here I'm going to say user text. What did I screw up here? Got my inputs ending tag. All right, so you've entered in. All right, so user text, I'm going to have display text update my state value for that. So I'm going to have const display text anonymous function. And then I'm going to say set user text to be. Now this is a little more advanced, but I think it's good to go over because you're going to deal with this in one of your challenges. Is, well, how do I know what the user entered in here? There are two ways I could go about this. One is I could find the control. So in this case, I would need an ID and saying this is input word. I could do what we've done before in JavaScript. I could do document.getElement by ID and fish it out by finding input word, right? We're just matching IDs here. I gave this control an ID, therefore I can find it by ID. Right, this is one way we do it. But the better way to do it is actually using events. We've done this a little bit, probably forgot about it, but it's worth discussing because it's not trivial to understand. Each one of these event handlers will automatically pass an event object to the event handler. So in this case, we're not using that event object. We're saying, hey, we don't care. We don't want any inputs. But by default, an event is going to be passed to each one of these event handlers. So if you want to use it, I could say, you know, event objects, name it whatever I want. And this is going to have the actual control that triggered the event. So I could say, let's lm element equals evt object dot current target. I think that's the correct way to do it. So current targets can refer to whichever element triggered this change. So now I could say set elements dot value. All right, so this is the control. Dot value is how we access the value of the input control. So this is going to be the new state value that's going to be reflected back to the user. And then if you want to kind of console log, and this is going to be delayed, console log user text. It's going to be off by 1, but we'll kind of see how that is being built up. So let's write user text. All right, so hopefully I wired this correctly. If not, React should tell me if I have any errors, which might be possible. Okay, so I have this button. I also have this text input. So let's say donuts. So notice how my user text is being built up. Each time I type in, let's start this again. So I type in donuts. Notice each time I get a state update. So each time I enter a character that on change event fires, I am handling that with this display text, which I get the current value, and I update my state value. The reason this matters is because I'm using that state value as part of my render. That's why I need a state value, because my rendering depends on this value being stored. Right, so now anytime I type here, notice that my word also builds up here. Right, so this is the state value being rendered on the screen. Any questions about that, Andrew Tran?
Can you go back to your code real quick?
Sure.
What in the world is set user text?
Set user.
Oh,
Right here? Yep, good question. That
oh,
is
never,
my
never mind. I
update.
see it. Yeah.
Sorry, it's hard to get everything on one screen with all these notes, but yeah, so that is the updating function that I'm using.
So you're calling. So right now you're calling a function inside your function.
Yep. Yeah. You can call functions within functions. Nothing wrong with that. But again, this is my updating function. This is going to update the value of user text. Whenever that updates, React will be like, all right, cool. I need to re-render this component. And it's going to say, all right, this has changed. Even though my counter has not changed, if this part changes, React's going to say, all right, let me try to recompute what needs to be displayed, figure out what actually is different. It's going to say, all right, this part is actually different between what's on screen versus what your component needs to show. It's going to specifically update this part of the page, not my entire page. But this button still works, so I can click that and it updates only this part. This is not being refreshed or re-rendered. React knows that this is not changing, so it's not going to waste resources updating the screen, because updating the screen is kind of expensive for applications. So it's only going to update the part of the screen that needs to update. Jesse.
Yeah, back on the code, is under the event on line 29, let element equal event object dot current target. Is dot current target just part of React?
No, so this is part of HTML. So this is an event object. The event object is always going to have a current target that refers to the control that generated the event. So this is basic. This is HTML, nothing to do with React. Read more about event objects, but you have a wealth of information that's passed on any event that happens from the user. So clicking a button, typing into a control, moving your mouse over a control, all of those actions by a user generate an event. An event object is sent to your event handlers if you want to use it. Again, we don't have to use it. Like here, not using it, that's fine. But we have the option to capture it if we want to use the event object, because it is being sent to these event handlers.
All right, thank you. That cleared it all up.
Yep, and just to reiterate it, we are not manually passing it, right? Right here, I'm not passing the event object to my function. This event handler is going to, or this event attribute is going to pass it when that event happens. So that's kind of just automatic functionality by your browser. Andrew Tran?
Just to reiterate, since your console.log runs, your set counter runs, your set user text runs asynchronously, so your console.log is delayed, right?
Yep, there's a delay by one character. So I'm setting a new value here, but that's asynchronous. So this is going to be one value behind. So if you want to see that again, I'm typing donuts, D, notice that my console is nothing. Oh, well then the D finally showed up. But that's because this console logging is one phase behind basically, due to the way I've implemented it.
Did you do like kind of similar to what we did in the past, like a JavaScript like defer script?
Not quite. So I know you guys are curious, like, well, how do I actually know when this updates? There's an answer for that. Again, it's React component lifecycle. That's definitely more complicated, so I don't want to dive too deeply into that. But there's a way to know exactly when something has updated and how to react to it from there on. This won't achieve what we want. Okay, so that's a really deep dive into state values. Again, understand, we need to use this useState function to create a state value and create a updating function, kind of all in one swoop. And then we need to use that updating function anytime we need to update our state values. You can still create local variables, like there's nothing wrong with that, but local variables will not, you should not use local variables when your rendering logic depends on certain values. These should be state values because React will want to know when to update the render. If these are local variables or global variables, it's not going to work how you want it to. Okay, that was a lot on states. We do have another game in town, that is prop values. Luckily, prop values aren't too complicated in my mind to understand, but I think we're probably due for a break because that was probably a long discussion. But we're gonna jazz up our, we're gonna change our application here to use more components and use prop values. So we're gonna see that after the break. I'm gonna clean up my code and kind of restore it to what we had before, just so that we, don't get too complicated. But after the break, we're gonna cover prop values and kind of just wrap up our introduction to React. So if you guys have any questions that pop up, we'll answer them after the break, if you guys are cool with that. What time is it? It is 11:31. Let's take a 9-minute break. Please be back at 11:40 and we'll wrap up React after that. All right, so we talked about state values kind of in depth, but hopefully we can understand why we need state values. We're gonna now learn about props, but before we get to props, let's kind of double back on creating components. So right now, we kind of just work with the app component. That was the component that already existed. We just modified it and added some logic to it to get, to our application here. But as our applications grow, we're gonna want to create more components and kind of nest functionality into separate pieces within our app. Again, this goes very similar to like, OOP design and just general application design, where we want to create more module units where it'd be like specific different functions, different files to kind of organize our logic in sensible ways. So although this is a very simple application, we're going to create additional components to understand how we can organize logic and reuse components accordingly. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my source folder, and then within that, I'm going to create a new folder. To be clear, this folder can be named anything you want. You don't even need to create a folder, but for organizational sake, I'm going to create a new folder and call it components, right? Because that's where I'm going to store my new components. Again, this is not like Django, to be clear. Django has specific folders you got to create. This is just for my organization's sake. I'm going to create a folder and happen to name it components. You can name it whatever you want. All right, so in this folder, I'm going to create a new file and call it button.js, or let's call it mybutton.js. This is going to be a new component that I'm going to create. So let's actually create from scratch. So mybutton.js. All right, let's create a bare bones component. Let's do that. I'm going to write function, the name of my component. There are some naming restrictions when you create components. I believe you must use an uppercase letter to start with. If you do not, React will kind of complain. So I'm going to call this my button just to match the name of my file. And that's what my component be names. All right, so function my button. And then I need to return some JSX. And then I need to export this. So export default my button. What I have here is, this is a very, very bare bones component. It's returning nothing. In fact, in this case, I think I need to return something. All right, this is returning absolutely nothing. I could write null here, that should be fine. But this is a component that is doing nothing at all, right? But we will obviously want to add more things in it. So we want to return JSX. So normally, I usually always add in a div. Again, divs are kind of invisible boxes that you add to your HTML page. But yeah, so I have a div here, nothing going to be shown right now. But what if I want to show a button? So my goal here is to move some logic from my app component down to other subcomponents. So I go back to app.js. I'm going to use this logic in my button. So I'm just going to copy it, put it over here. And now this component is specifically responsible for rendering the button, not the output, not anything else, just the button that's going to say click me. All right, so that's one component I've created here. I'm going to create another component. And I'm going to name that my label. Actually, I want to make sure what the curriculum page says so I don't veer off track. I think it's my output or something. What does that have? my output label is what I called it. So I'll match the name in there. So this component will be called my output label. And let's create another component here. So again, function name of my component is my output label. I'm going to return some JSX. In this case, I'll return empty div. And then I want to export default my output label. All right, and this is going to have the display part of my app. So I'm going to go back to app.js, grab that functionality right here, and then put that into my output label. So again, we're just nesting away functionality. We're not changing functionality here. We're just creating some smaller components so that we could reuse them if we need to. All right, so now I have two new components. I have my button, which has kind of what we had before, and also my output label, which we had before. However, there are some things that we kind of lost with this transition, and we'll see that in a second. So let's go back to app.js. Now, again, I copied code out of here, right? There was some functionality there. I want to add that back in. So now I'm going to import my components that I just created. So I'm going to comment that and import one component was my button. So again, VS Code kind of autofilled that, but you're going to navigate to the location of that file. You don't need to put .js, that's kind of implied, but I usually put that just to be, super clear on what file type it is. All right, so my button is the component I'm getting from that file, and I'm importing my output label from .components because that's the folder I created. Again, if you name your folder something else, make sure you import it correctly. All right, so I'm importing two components. Now, if I want to render them, as we saw before in our slides, we just need to use angle brackets and name the component. So in this case, I want to show my button and my output label. So I'm not intending to change anything in the display, anything in the functionality, but I just kind of nested away logic inside of these components. So now my app component, which is my top level component, when that gets to rendering, it's going to say, all right, I need to render my button. Well, how do I know what to render? Guess what? We look in my button and say, all right, this is the render for this component. All right, which is going to render a div and a button. These divs are optional in this case, but we'll talk about why I usually think it's best practice to just add some divs or some top level elements, even if you don't need them. But okay, so we have some problems here. Notice that my button wants to call increment counter when that button's clicked. There's no knowledge of increment counter in my button's world. Increment counter does not exist here. It exists in our app.js. Maybe I should do split screen since I'm switching back and forth so much. There we go. Let's get my button here. So my button wants to call the event handler that we had before, but that event handler exists in the app level, not in the my button child level. So app in this case is the parent component. My button is the child component in this this context. The question is, how can the child get access to this function? By default, a child cannot communicate directly with its parent. There's no default way that a child just can talk to the parent. Again, this is atypical because humans, we can talk to our parents all the time. In React, child components cannot by default talk to their parents. Parents have the ability to talk to their children though, in terms of passing some values down. So my button is a child for the app component. The app can pass down what we call prop values. So these are a second type of values, right? We talked about internal values, which are state values. Prop values are simply values passed from a parent down to a child. We don't need to use useState. We don't need to do anything special really, aside from having some mechanism to pass some value from the parent, in this case, app.js, down to button or mybutton.js, because my button is being rendered by the app. So to do that, it's actually very simple. We can create new variables here. So in this case, I'm going to say handle click. This is effectively a variable I'm creating that will be accessible in my button. This looks very similar to attributes, right? We have an HTML element here. We have an attribute name and a value. We do the same thing with these values here. So I have the prop name, and I can give it a value. So the value I'm going to give it is increment counter. So what this is doing is saying new variable called handle click. it's going to refer to increment counter, which is my function at the parent level. So now my child element, or my child component, sorry, is going to have access to this function through handle click. All right, so this was a name I chose, and this is the name of the function or the value that I want to pass. So in this case, I have a function called increment counter. I'm passing a reference to that. Notice I'm not calling this function. Make sure we don't make that mistake. We don't want to call this function. We just want to refer to this function and have it be called by someone else. So handle click is what I'm passing down as a prop value. And this is where React does some of the magic for us. So in order for me to access handle click in my child component, I need to accept props as the first parameter for my function. All right, props is an object. So let's document this. Props is a JavaScript object, also known as a dictionary. I prefer the name dictionary. It makes more sense in my head. Can I get that on one line? Yeah, so this is an object. This is something that React kind of builds for us and passes to our component. This object is going to contain every single prop value that you send down. So meaning, right now I'm passing one value. I can pass as many props as I desire to. So I can say, donuts equal yummy. That could be a prop value. I could say, we don't have many other state values, but again, this is another prop value assigned to a value. So here on my child side, this props object will have one entry for handle click, which will refer to the function we told it to point to. We'll also have another entry called donuts, and its value is going to be yummy, right? These are key value pairs. So the key is the prop name, and the value is exactly what value we specify. So the first parameter to your functional component must be the props value if you want to use it. So you can leave this empty and say, we don't care about props, that's fine. But the first parameter is always going to refer to the props object. And by convention, we're going to name it props. All right, now that we have an input to this function, we can use this props object and say props.increment counter. Sorry, not increment counter, handle click. Because handle click is a value that we've sent down from the parent down to the child. It's captured in this object, and now we can access anything from that object that we know is going to exist. I'm going to pause here because I want to make sure I'm not going too quickly, but the idea here is the parent passes down one or many values. And in order for us to access that, we capture it in this object called props, and then use props.whatever to access those values. I saw some hands raised. Let's answer some questions. Jesse.
More of a, just to clarify, make sure I'm understanding it. So the handle click has to be put in on the my button, and that will allow us to utilize the function or the component on the function my button to use props. And then, but you would have, in order to call that in that function, you have to do props.handleClick.
Yep.
Is that
fact,
right?
Yeah. So again, props is an object that's going to have key value pairs. The keys are what you specify. You can name them whatever you want for the most part. And then the values are going to be whatever value you send down. So the parent is sending down yummy as a value and storing that in a variable effectively called donuts. So if I wanted to refer to yummy down here, I could say, again, this doesn't make much sense, but I could say paragraph, donuts are props.donuts. So this is going to refer to whatever value I've stored in that variable. So in this case, donuts is the name of the variable I created. Props.donuts is how I access it here, because that's the name of the object. So if I change this object name to like stuff, then I would say stuff.donuts. And by convention, we name it props, but stuff should work if we spell it correctly. So another hand raised. Marcos.
Yeah. I was just gonna ask, so what's the purpose of like defining the functions in the main app.js compared to defining them in the actual component?
Excellent question. So this goes into design considerations. So app is the parent component. In this case, if we did not care about the counter value outside of button, then we want to create this state value, and we'd want this to be in button. If we only care about the value inside of button. However, there's something else that we're going to add here. So I'm going to put a pin on that. I'm going to come back to it. But the idea here is your common relative should store the state values. Meaning in this case, if we can kind of imagine where this is going, I have my button, which is going to trigger an event and call increment counter. My output label also wants to know about counter, right? In this case, my button wants to effectively call set counter. My output label wants to deal with counter. That's why this state value should exist in app, because it's like the central, connection between my button and my output label. These are sibling components. Sibling components cannot talk to each other directly. So what I'm saying is my button can't say, hey, sibling, my output label, here's the new value of counter. That's not capable in React. Siblings cannot talk to each other, which is weird because in humans, siblings can talk to each other all the time. In this case, my button needs to go up to the parent and say, hey, here's a new value of counter or whatever it's sending. And then the parent's going to pass down a value to my output label so that my output label can use it. So in this case, I'm going to add another prop value here and say counter equals counter. Again, this name can be anything I want it to be. This is referring to my state value that I've created above. So again, usually I will name the prop value the same value as the state value, but you don't have to, right? Here, we created something called handle click, which has no naming resemblance to increment counter. That's our choice as a designer. But usually you will see, or I will, write my prop value being the same name as my state value. So now my output label should have access to something called counter through its props. So to make sure we don't get off naming, this should be named props, and I don't think props. All right, so we go to our other component, which I have right here. Again, we need access to counter. By default, my output label does not know about the state value. The parent must explicitly communicate it, whatever value it wants to send down. In this case, we're going to send the state value down here. And so then we want to use it here. Then we need to make two changes. Capture the props objects and then access the prop objects here. So again, the way I just imagine it, if you guys are still kind of struggling to understand, imagine we just have a function called myFunc. I want to pass it some values. We can create any variables we want. We could say, A and B, or I can name this, apple and banana, whatever I want to name it. Right? We have a function and we want to use these values, console.log apple, console.log banana. Right? These are naming choices. We can name these variables anything we want to. When we want to call this function, we need to pass it some values. In this case, we call this function by calling myFunc and say apples are juicy and bananas are sweet, I guess. Right? These are the values we're sending, and these are what's kind of receiving those values. That's kind of the same thing that's going on right here, right? If I want to kind of mirror that, I'd say apple equal juicy. And then I could say banana equals sweet, right? So again, these are just effectively parameters we are creating on the other side, and we're passing it values here. Again, it's not the same thing, but effectively props are passing values from one level. In this case, this is our parent world, sending it down to our child component. And now our child should have access to it, but the difference, key difference here, we don't accept parameters one by one. Instead, we get a props object, and that's going to be a dictionary, I guess, an object that has all of these values kind of combined in them. So we'll have apple and banana and donuts and handle click available inside this single object. No matter how many props we pass down, we're going to have one object on the other side that has all of them bundled up inside of there. Questions? Jesse.
Yes. Question I had, is this considered more of a inheritance or composition with using props?
I'm going to say neither. So props is just passing one value to another. Inheritance and composition, I think those are a little different in terms of use cases. So I'm going to say, yeah, it's neither of those. It's more just, again, imagine passing a value from one function to another, or, you know, calling a function, you want to pass it some parameters or some arguments, you will do it this way. But instead of calling them arguments, we call them prop values, also known as properties.
Okay.
So we want to pass something down to the child. This is what we specify, and that's what the child receives on the other end. Jake.
Do we need to worry about like async issues in the return statement there, like where my output label is counter, and that may not like before increment counter takes place or something, you know what I mean? Like you showed us earlier. Is
Yeah.
it possible that counter will print out a different value than we're expecting?
No, if we do things in the React sanctioned way, it's going to work automatically. So the way it works is any state value or prop value that gets updated. So in this case, let's connect the wires. What's going to happen is my button is this component. So let's go over to my button. When the user clicks this button, we don't need donuts anymore for that. When they click this button, we're going to call some function that's referred to by props.handle click. That is effectively going to call increment counter because we've wired it up saying, hey, handle click actually refers to increment counter. So the connection is here where we call handle click on this side. That is mapped over to increment counter. So we click that button in the child component, that kind of bubbles up to the parent component because we've made this connection right here saying, hey, this prop value actually refers to a parent function. So let's actually call that, and that the parent function will be called. Next, when this function gets called, a state value on the app level gets updated. So we call set counter that eventually will be, you know, updating counter. Whenever counter does update, this is going to re-render because this value changes. Therefore, the prop value coming in here will change, and this will re-render also. So this kind of automatically happens anytime a state or prop value changes. So in this case, the state value changes, which is turned into a prop right here. So in terms of my output label, this value, whenever that changes, will update what you see on the screen. So again, when props update, React will automatically re-render that component. Jake, did that answer? Or so
Yeah,
short answer
thank
is no, you're never going to get the wrong value of counter here because React is automatically going to update it when it needs to. It's not going to like randomly try to update it just for fun.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yep. So again, state and prop values, whenever those change, React will automatically try to re-render your component and any child components that depend on those values. Jin, question.
Yeah, I get that on clicks, kind of like the event handler when you're like clicking something.
Yep.
I'm still kind of trying to wrap around what the handle click is. Are you creating that because you said the child component cannot talk to the parent component?
Yep. So this is kind of you're going to see this very often where a child wants to talk to the parent. The best way to do that is pass down a prop with a function, and then the child can call that function and pass back a value if it needs to. For example, let's say we want to pass back a new value here. I could call, let's say we want to pass back 10. Let's say we want to increment value. So instead of always incrementing by 1, let's say we have an increment value. So now the child is allowed to say, I don't know why I screwed up here. How that div get here? Now the child is passing back a value of 10 to the parent, and the parent can use it. What else is screwed up here? I think I lost some. Oh, div. Sorry, one sec. Can't see what I screwed up here. So this div is not happy.
Hey, Ankur, so if that's an error function, is 10 the parameter name?
Yeah, do I need to?
I mean, it'd have to be like a valid variable name, no? I
I
don't know if that's what your linter is complaining about.
just want to pass a value of 10, but you might be right. So if I say X and X, All right, so in this case, I need to create, all right, this is gonna be a bad example, so I'm gonna kind of want to give up on it, but let's go through with it. So in this case, let's create an event handler here and say, do something, taking a value of ink. Let's do it this way. So I want to call props dot, kind of regret going down this example, but we'll do it. Handle click, that's still a prop value. And we want to pass it the increment. So again, if we pass it a value of 10, the click counter should go up by 10. Let's, we could add multiple buttons. So let's say button. And then we want to call, I see what I was doing wrong, but do something and say this will go up by 1, or do something and this will go up by 10. So now we're gonna have 2 buttons. If we click one of them, we should increment our counter by 1. If we increment the second one, it's gonna go up by 10. So here I need to do that. Sorry guys, I feel like this is gonna get more confusing. All right, so we have a function that takes an increment value. Based on which button we click, we either pass it 1 or 10, and that's gonna call the parent function. So let's see how this works. Let's see. All right, so now we have 2 buttons. Let's make sure we understand the flow of everything. When I click this button, we are in my button. My button is gonna call an intermediate event handler here. So event handlers. We do an on click. This anonymous function is gonna call do something. Do something is gonna call handle click. So a lot of function hopping here. But in this case, we pass it an increment value and then pass that value to increment counter. We could actually subvert do something and maybe do just props.handle click. That's what I was trying to do before. One less function to deal with here. Again, important thing, this is an anonymous function. We're not calling the function right now. We are just telling onClick which function to call when this event happens. So let me get rid of the extra stuff. So in this case, we're going to pass a different value to handle click, which is an alias for increment counter. So now if we try clicking these, that didn't work. That should increment by 10. Not sure why that doesn't increment by 10. So we're saying take the current counter value, increment by increment value. I'm a little confused here. All right, so ignoring that, I'll need to fix that eventually. But we get the updated value, set counter gets called, that updates counter eventually, and that trickles down to my counter or my output label because we are passing down the counter as a prop value. It's going to bother me why that's not going up by 10, but I see a lot of hands raised. So Jin, follow-up question?
No, not really. I was just making sure, like, so that handle click is just kind of more like in a way, like a variable.
Yeah, it's a variable that
Okay.
we chose the
Right.
name of, and then we are saying that variable points to a function. So we can call handle click just like a function because it's referring to a function right here. Increment counter is our function right here. Andrew
Okay.
Trin.
When you do your handle click, is it immediately calling the function above it and changing the state value there? Or is it running through the entire mybutton.javascript thing and then from that entire JavaScript thing, pushing it up with the export default thing?
Sorry, you lost me with that question. Did you rephrase?
So when you click like that props.handle click there on the page, is it immediately changing the state value of the component above, or is it waiting until at the very end and then returning the value from everything being run in the JavaScript?
Well, when you click this button, we are saying call this function. So it's going to call up to handle click, which again is an alias for increment counter. So yeah, it's going to happen, I guess, immediately that we call into this function. Again, this update is going to take a while to process, as in it's asynchronous, so it will happen eventually.
So in this case, the child talks to the parent immediately.
Yes. Yep. It's a direct call when that click event happens. Okay, Courtney, question?
The on-click is like a built-in method, right?
Yep. So these are event attributes. Again, that's going to require some Googling. So if we do a quick
Yeah.
Google, events, handlers, attributes, I know there's a good page for it. So yeah, these are all the different types of events that could be triggered. So there could be an error for Windows, mouse events. So when you move a mouse onto a control, off of a control, all of these have specific event attributes that can be called.
So I guess what I'm wondering is, like, if we just wanted a button, like earlier we had it on the app.js, just the on click. This is just so we can use prop functionality is why we're doing this extra stuff.
Yeah, well, the reason we create this component is to show up creating multiple components. And then yes, to actually use props, you want to have a parent component and then pass values down. And these are what prop values are. Essentially, prop values ultimately are state values in one component. So again, counter is a state value in terms of apps perspective. And then we pass a state value down to my output label. And that's referred to as a prop value with regards to my output label. Because my output label is not managing the value counter. It's just accepting it through the props and displaying it or doing whatever it needs to do with it. I don't know if that's what your question was, though.
I guess best practice, are we going to be using props for like a simple button is my question.
For a simple button, it's hard for me to answer that. So in this case, we did not have to create other components, right? We had our functionality where we had all the logic in our app.js, but just for this example, I wanted to create more components. And now that I have more components, I do need to use props to kind of communicate back and forth between child and parent and pass down values kind of through different levels. So in this case, the button is using a prop value to call a function in the parent. And then my output label is using a prop value just to get information and display that information. I feel like I probably lost a lot of people there.
All right, one more question.
Go for it.
So if instead of handle click right there, if you were to put on click, I understand it wouldn't work with the prop, but like, would it just take the on click functionality then?
Are you talking about right here if I put handle click?
No, on the app.js. I know it wouldn't work, but
where would I put it?
I guess you can just put it, like if you were to utilize it anywhere on the app.js, it would work normally. It's not like looking for a function that we created, I guess is what I was asking.
Sorry, apologies. I think you lost me there. So handle click here is going to be used only in the child component. It's not used anywhere in the parent component. This is effectively like creating a new variable that the child can use freely through the props objects. I don't know if I don't think that answered it.
Yeah.
But...
No, it makes sense. I got it.
Okay. Still not sure why this increment value is not being used and it's bothering me, but let's continue.
Did you refresh your page by chance?
I did not, but all right, cool. That did fix it. So not sure why refreshing was needed there, but cool. Now it actually works. Thanks, John Winko. So now I can increment by 10 or 1. Cool. That was bothering me. So thanks. Lyman.
So is the reason you have to do an anonymous function in your my button component is because you're passing in, you're technically calling the function because you need that parameter passed in to tell it how much to increment it by?
Yes. Sorry, I'm having trouble picking up your audio, but were you asking about this anonymous function right here?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so we need to create an anonymous function here, again, because we don't want to call the function right now. We want to tell onClick which function to call. So that's why we need to create an anonymous function that's going to be called. And this will be executed once the click happens. Again, the difference is...
That's because in your increment counter event handler in your app.js, you created a property that needed to be used. So that's why you have to do it, because technically by using those properties, it's calling the function. So you're using an anonymous. Okay, I'm just trying to wrap my head around. It makes sense.
So the difference here, again, I can't write it like this because this will call this function immediately when this is being rendered, right? I only want this function to be called when the click happens. So that's why I create a new kind of function in line here saying that, hey, this is the function you need to call when this event happens. This, on the other hand, saying, hey, let's call this function right now, even without a click happening.
And if you had it the way you did before for the ink value as a property, you could with the other way. Does that make sense? Simple.
Sorry,
When you just had it increment by 1.
Yep.
And you have that ink value in your event handler as a property to pass to it. You could just do props.handle click without calling it, right?
Yeah, if this took in, no parameters, then I don't need to pass in anything here.
And could you also get rid of, because I'm trying to think, because that handle.click is just, it's also in your, it's referencing the event handler here. Yeah, okay, yeah. That's what I was just wondering, because adding the property kind of forced you to use the anonymous function.
Yeah, you got it. Good question. Sorry, I understand it now. So in this case, if we don't want to pass a value, in this case, I have a default value. Yeah, then I can just tell it the function name that I want to call. And if I do want to pass a value, I need to do this anonymous function business because, again, I need to pass a value later on, not right now. So this would let me have a default value. In this case, call that function. Default value is going to be 1. Cool. If I do want to specify a value explicitly, then yes, I need to go through this business or create like an intermediate function outside and do that.
Perfect. Thank you, sir.
Okay, so we are running into lunchtime. So I do want to wrap up here. So again, those are prop values. Prop values, simplified, just values you pass down from a parent down to a child so that the child can use some additional information that the parent wants to tell it about. Again, you can pass it a function as you've done here, right? My button was sent a function via props so that my button could call back into the parent. That's a design paradigm you're going to see very often where a child wants to pass back some information to the parent. Otherwise, you're going to see, prop values just sent down to a child and the child's going to render, use that prop value however it wants to and display it. Important takeaway, as we talked about, again, do not manually edit state and prop values. So just to kind of touch upon that again, as we saw for state values, I should not do counter equals counter plus ink value, right? This is going to, yes, update counter, but React is not going to know that counter is updated. So none of this is going to re-execute. All this stuff will stay the same. My output label will not know that there's a new counter value. So this will not achieve what we want within React. Same thing for prop values. Notice I have access to an object here. I should never do something like a props that counter equals 7, right? This is directly modifying prop values. This is not what you should be doing, right? So again, if you catch yourself doing this, you are not designing with React correctly.
Anchor, I have another question related to that.
Sure.
What if you do the reverse? Like, what if you assign a variable to equal props.counter?
If I do const some value equal that.
Yeah, is that okay, or is that also not allowed?
This could be tricky because if counter happens to be like an object or a list or an array, whatever you want to call it, then this is going to refer to the same thing. If this is like an integer, then that's going to be fine. Now I could do, some value equals 7. This is going to be fine if this were an integer. However, if this is a list, or I guess I should say array, this is not going to do what we want. So I think that's the last thing I want to cover before lunch. I know I'm kind of eating into your lunchtime, but I think it's good thing to discuss. So on that note, what if I had a new state value? Let's say data, set data, and this is going to be an array. States. All right, I'm going to make this be an array. What if I want to update this array? Let's say I want to keep track of all the past counter values. How would I do that? Well, in this case, if data is keeping track of that, I want to do call set data. What if I do something like this? Let new data equals data. I want to do new data dot push. Let's say counter plus ink value. That's going to raise some more questions, but hopefully we could push through. So I'm going to do this and say, hey, my new data is going to be new data. Let's say we want to render this. I'm just going to do this kind of in place here. So another thing I have not shown, so a good thing to show is, again, we call JavaScript. We've not done this too much. But in here, I could call a function and have that do some rendering for me. So let's say call this render data. So again, anything inside of curly braces is JavaScript, right? Inside of here, I'm referring to a JavaScript variable. Same thing here. That's a JavaScript function that I've created before. This can be another function that I can create in case I don't want my render to get too complicated. So I could do const render data, and then I don't know how to display this, so let's do let elements equal empty array. So I need to convert my data to some visual elements. So I'm going to do a for loop, let I equal 0, I less than data.length, I plus plus. So we're just going through our data array, and we're going to store JSX code inside elements. So we're going to do a push and push. Let's just do paragraphs. So again, make sure we understand our syntax. Curly braces means access JavaScript. So in this case, I'm going to do data at I. So again, this is JSX code that I'm entering in. So this is my JavaScript portion where I'm accessing data at index I, and I want to return elements. So this function is going to create a bunch of JSX code for me. And it's going to be used part of my render. So right, I'm rendering it right here. This is going to be substituted with JSX that's returned from this function. So if I do this, let's see what happens. And maybe put a display here. HR, let's say. All right, let's see if this works. Kind of doing it ad lib, refresh. Objects, I want. All right, I know we want to get to lunch. So here, data should be keeping track of each value. Maybe that's console log data. All right, I think I should wrap up soon though. Apologies for going over. All right, data is an object, not quite what I want.
You have to access the value inside of it if you're pushing. You're pushing HTML element into.
So I'm pushing the value here, which should be an integer, but here it's saying it's an object, which again, this is not going to be easy to understand. So we're getting data, we push a new value into data, and we set new data. All right. So again, the thing I want to highlight here, ignore that this is not working, is this is not working as we want it to. This is not creating a new copy of the data. This is still modifying the original state value. This is bad because this is updating data. All right, this is kind of a trap that developers fall into. This is not, again, this is not creating a new copy of data. This is referring to the same thing that data was referring to. So in this case, this is not going to work. This is updating our state value directly. The way we'd actually want to do this is we do something like this weird syntax using a spread operator and saying the new value we're going to tack on here. This is creating a brand new list that is independent of what data was pointing to. So this is the correct way to update an array. This is the wrong way. So we had let new data equals data. This is wrong, because this is directly modifying what data pointed to. Again, if you are confused by why this equal sign does not copy it, that's something that you might need to kind of refresh yourself on. But data is pointing to some memory location. New data is pointing to that same memory location. Therefore, new data that push is going to actually modify what data was referring to. This, on the other hand, the spread operator, which is kind of new syntax probably, is going to take data, break it apart, and reassemble that into a new array. So this is the appropriate way to update an array. Because it's a state value, we do not want to directly update a state value. All right, I think we need to take a lunch break. So here's what I'm going to say. We have some challenges for the evening, so let me pause the recording.